Hi, this is Lord Sablin and today we will be reviewing the army roster of Kislev in Total War Warhammer 3. These are my own opinions on their units and your experience with them may vary. With this in mind, let us get to it. Kislev has generally strong unit roster centered around hybrid units, more so than Grand Cafe. They are well equipped to go against all demon factions. The struggle could only come against Ogre Kingdoms and Grand Cafe. When it comes to factions from previous Warhammer games, their roster may be overshadowed by Empire or High Elves, possibly Dwarves. First, let us take a look at available legendary lords, of which there are 3. Tsarina Katarin, Kostaltin and Red Tsar Boris Ursun. Tsarina Katarin is most likely going to be the first legendary lord you play as in the Realms of Chaos campaign. She is a pure caster lord with some staying power in melee. Overall, ice magic she wields is pretty good lore of magic, not the best, but certainly not the worst. Her value comes from her strategic position on the map as well as her campaign bonuses. Upkeep reduction towards ice guards is also very useful. Kostaltin is a Grand Patriarch of Grand Orthodoxy, a firm believer in Ursun and opposed to the way Katarin leads Kislev. He is similar in ways to Volkmar the Grim or Battle Priests of the Empire. He has all buffs regular Patriarchs get, the only difference is that he gets to use all of them. As for his use in battle, he is fairly good at staying in melee, although he is best being used as a support lord right behind his holding infantry. As for the last legendary lord Kislev has access to, Boris Ursun is your run-of-the-mill melee lord that specializes in battle prowess and buffing bear riders in your army. There is not much to talk about when it comes to his use in battle, he is pretty straightforward. Out of all of these legendary lords, Tsarina Katarin is probably most useful as Kislevite armies are very ranged heavy and she is very good at slowing enemies down so that your hybrid infantry units can shoot them down. Now let us move to your generic lords. First we have a Boyar, who basically serves as a standard melee lord with some support capabilities. There is a special kind of boyars available in your campaigns though, Atamans. Atamans are boyars that can be deployed as an administrators to a certain region on the map. You will get 1 Ataman slot for every 2 provinces you own. Each few turns there can be an event triggered where you will be offered a choice that will influence the Ataman's combat or campaign capabilities. Thus, boyars can be useful in the campaign. Ice or Tempest Ice Witches are your second option for your generic armies. These are much more useful. In fact, I would recommend getting just these to serve as generals in your armies. Magic has always been a crucial part of any Warhammer game and their casting abilities will overshadow any melee use of boyars. As for heroes, Ice and Tempest Witches are basically just like Witch Lords. You want these in your armies if you are running a melee general like Kostaltin or Boris Ursun. As with any other heroes, they can perform other tasks on campaign map, although witches should be used in your armies. Magic is just too good to pass up. Patriarchs are fairly good at supporting your holding infantry or later on elemental bears. These should be used on campaign map more than witches as they do not bring too much use in battle. They get some buffs, but only limited to 1 of 3 available and that is basically it. They are useful for wounding enemy characters though. Now for the infantry. Almost all of the infantry units are hybrids, so they can both shoot and fight in melee with only exception being Tsar guards. As Kislev ranged units have the same properties, I think it is only fair to talk about them in the same section of the guide. Let us first start with regular Khazars. These are your first recruitable units in the game. You have 2 options here. You can go regular Khazars, who will use axe in combat, or Khazars with spears, who will do better job of fighting cavalry. Your early game army will then consist of 5 units of regular Khazars and around 4 units of Khazars with spears. You might also just go full Khazar army with no cavalry, although you will already have some advanced units with each starting legendary lord. Armored Khazars with shields or great weapons are your next tier infantry. They have shorter range than regular Khazars, but have greater holding or punching power. Mostly, you will want to have armored Khazars with shields to serve as your holding infantry with some ranged capabilities. If up against an army without any ranged capabilities, you can put armored Khazars with great weapons in your army instead. They have some armor piercing and are more damaging in charge. Other than that, I would probably recommend sticking with the shield variant. Most of what you will go up against should be dealt with your ranged units, and having a good holding unit is more important. Armored Khazars with shields will also fire one more volley than the great weapons variant, as they do not need to charge to make the best use of them. Next up we have Tsargarst. These are your elite holding infantry units. I recommend getting at least 5 of them, but probably 6. The shield variant is also infinitely more useful than the great weapons variant, but I guess you could make them work up against enemies with little to no ranged capabilities. There is not much else to say about Tsargards, just a superb holding infantry. Buffed by a patriarch, they will hold really well. Now it is time to talk about stealthy units. These can be recruited from a tier 3 basic military building and serve basically as your frontline ranged units. They have better range as armored Khazars, although they have one great weakness. While they are okay in melee, they will lose any fight they get into, and if up against ranged heavy factions, these are going to be the first units to be targeted. And thus they will die pretty quickly as they do not have any shield. My recommendation is to almost never use these. They need to be charged to do full damage they can do, but then you lose some of those volleys, and infantry units are pretty fast in this game. If you are playing Boris Urson, for example, you will go up against ogres, and their units are pretty fast. As Kostaltin, you will encounter Nakari sooner rather than later, and as Katarin, you will mostly go up against other Kislevites who will bring a lot of ranged units. You could use them against greenskins or dwarves, but these are not going to be your primary enemies later on. Anyway, let us talk about the best ranged unit Kislev has to offer, Ice Guards. There are two variants, Swords and Glaive. Both have the same range stats, but I would argue that Ice Guards with Glaives are more useful. They have anti-large capabilities and thus can negate flying enemies that Zinch and Nurgle like to bring up against the player. Cavalry of Slanesh and Khorne are also going to have harder time bringing them down. Same thing with Ogres. The Swords variant has their uses as well. If up against infantry heavy faction, they will do a fairly good job at melee. Still, best place for your Ice Guards is going to be behind your holding infantry. Now we will talk about their melee and missile cavalry. First off, we have Kosovite dervishes, a crappy unit if you ever saw one. Their charge bonus is actually not that bad, but aside from ramming into the backlines or running down routing units, their use is negligible. They do not have any holding power in melee and will die in a minute or less. Almost anything can and will kill them in a prolonged fight. Still, they are your basic garrison units, and you will need to learn how to use them properly so they can be of at least some use. Horse archers are basically Kosovite dervishes with bows. They are a bit more useful, but in the grand scheme of things they will melt even quicker in melee, and having more Khazars is infinitely more useful than investing into horse archers. I would actually love to see more of them in garrisons, as you can get more value out of them than Kosovite dervishes. Now, winged lancers can be a bit more useful. They do decent damage on the charge and can be used more effectively as hammer in the hammer and anvil tactics. Generally, you want to use them after your infantry gets engaged with the enemy. They will hold a bit longer in melee, but will still die pretty fast. You will mostly go up against armies that will have armor-piercing capabilities or anti-large units, and thus your winged lancers will be likely outmatched one-on-one with the enemy flanks. But if you are able to A. destroy enemy and anti-large units before your infantry line meets theirs, or B, enemy does not have a cavalry of their own, you can outmaneuver the enemy and use them pretty effectively as a shock cavalry. If not, bring more armored or regular Cossars instead. Griffon Legion is basically an upgraded version of linked Lancers. The same can be applied to them. Griffon Legion can stay in melee longer, as they have better melee stats and higher armor, but up against enemy cavalry or anti-large units, they will still eventually lose, especially against Khorne, who likes to field various of chaos with halberds and his hard-hitting armor-piercing cavalry, Blood Crushers of Khorne. Slaanesh also fields many armor-piercing cavalry units, and ogres are the same. Against dwarves or greenskins though, feel free to bring some of them. Warbear Riders are your elite cavalry units, and in my book these are the best intercepting cavalry in the game. With high armor and high weapon strength, they hit hard and can stay in melee and actually win, even though they can get pretty damaged in the process. They are not as good of a hammer as Griffon Legion, but that is not their primary role. What they excelled at is intercepting enemy cavalry or flanking units and attacking backlines of the enemy. As such, they are of great use to Kislev, who can get encircled when up against infantry-based factions of Slaanesh, Khorne or Nurgle. These units are in fact so good you can doomstack them with characters like Boris Ursun, who provides great buffs for Warbear Riders. The opposite can be said about light and heavy war sleds. It is no secret that you need some superb micro skills to get enough out of any chariot unit to pay for itself, and these are no different. While they can do a lot of damage if used properly, they do not have the same staying power as Warbear Riders. To keep them charging in would also most probably put them in danger of friendly fire from your own ranged units, and they are not very useful on your flanks. I guess they would do good enough against factions that do not have a great anti-large or cavalry units and have small mass. But against ogres, Khorne and Slaanesh, these units will not do good enough of a job. And they are quite vulnerable against flying units as well. They will do a horrible job against Tzeentch especially. I would not bring them into my army over Warbear Riders and probably not even Griffon Legion. The micro is just too intense. We will move now to monsters and artillery. Snow leopards are your early game monsters, and I hate them with passion. Their unit mass is too low and they will not do well at tying up several units. They will also die pretty quickly in prolonged melee and will not occupy enemy lords and heroes for long. I guess against enemy heroes they will do fine, but lords are too big of a target for them, and up against infantry they will simply lose. Snow leopards can also be spawned by your witches. They are much more useful as a spawn than a stable in your army. A single unit of regular Cossars can do more damage than one snow leopard though. Elemental bears are an interesting unit. Because of their size, they are pretty easy targets for ranged units. Their melee defense is also lacking. They are pretty strong though and can easily defeat enemy lords and heroes if targeted properly. They also have a breath attack, which is quite damaging to enemy infantry. These are best used when up against enemy with limited ranged capabilities. I would put maybe 2 of them in my army to fight alongside my Tsar guards. Still, there is a case for bringing in more ice guards or Warbear Riders over elemental bears. Still, they can be useful against legendary lords like Nakari and Skarbrand. They will hold them in place and your ranged units will shoot them down. They will take a lot of damage though, so be careful. Also, melee lords and even soul grinders and other single entity units will often ignore the engagement and simply move on to more desirable encounters. The only piece of artillery in Kislev unit roster is Little Grom. And what an artillery piece it is. It has a great range, Great. Ranged attack will stay in melee for a while, and his speed is on the level of basic infantry unit. This makes him great to first pepper enemy from afar, and once your infantry lines are engaged, flank the enemy and shoot at him from the sides. By just bringing 2 of them, you already made great strides to securing victory for yourself. It's especially useful against Nurgle, whose units are really slow. Just a beast of a unit that will pay for itself many times over. And this is the whole unit roster of Kislev. They excel at both ranged and melee combat and are especially effective at fighting demons of chaos. Their early game roster is not best suited to fight other factions though, and their early to mid game cavalry are effective only in limited situations. Once they get their hands on their elite units, it is a game over for most enemy factions. The only mismatch I see is actually Grand Cafe and Zinch. Both present challenge for Kislev, especially as they are both ranged and have superiority in flying units, as Kislev doesn't have any. Other mismatch could potentially be Bretonia or High Elves, as these factions have better range units or fast and strong cavalry both in the air and on the ground. I will also make a campaign guide for all Kislev legendary lords, focusing mainly on diplomacy, as it is the key to making sure you have as few of enemies as possible. This has been Lord Savlin, and I look forward to seeing you next time.